Hey there everyone. Today I would like to discuss Thomas Hobbes's The Leviathan. This is a critical work in political theory, understanding the way that power relates to our social lives, the way that morality and ethics come to be ingrained in us as a compulsion, the way we gain experiences and knowledge. Lots of interesting stuff here about epistemology and authority, and there's a lot of important ideas in here, such as the social contract, the centrality of power and authority in maintaining a political regime. And there's a lot of good ideas in here, but also a lot of very bad ideas. The political regime established and advocated for here is basically an authoritarian one. It is about the maintenance of authority through a representative of a community who comes to, as Hobbes will say, bear the person of the community, which is to say, not only will they nominally represent the community, but de jure and through their actions, they will actually enact the community's will, such that they literally come to bear the personhood of the community. Therefore, Hobbes wants to try to understand how the unity of a commonwealth can be maintained, how a plurality of voices can come in a very scientific way to embody a common nationality, a common culture, in a way that they will actually maintain their obligations and duties to one another. Now, Hobbes is part of the empiricist tradition. He's very interested in the natural sciences and the way that we can glean knowledge of the world from experience and through experimentation with the world. As such, Hobbes understands the world as being matter in motion. And this motion is impressed upon our senses in a number of ways that gives us sense experience. And we take this sense experience and we represent it in our heads as a series of images, of states of being, and we can compare these with one another, either adding them together or subtracting them from another, and this is the process that Hobbes calls reason. By reason, we can use imagination to create things which are derivative from experience but not directly found in experience, in such a way that we can anticipate the future. Thereafter, we can use desire to help us get from our current means to our desired ends. Thus, desire allows us to use the vitality of life to meet specified, imagined ends that weren't actually there in nature in the first place. We imagine a possible future that wasn't at the time present. And because Hobbes understands the universe to be matter in motion, he understands that motion is life, and the cessation of that motion is death. Think about the way the body works. The body is a series of flows that is trying to maintain its environment in a state of homeostasis, of stability in which none of the salinity levels are too high or too low, the pH isn't out of whack, the temperature is in a suitable range. All of these are used to keep the motion of the body going, to keep the blood pumping, to keep the air coming in and out and circulating, to keep thoughts occurring in a steady manner, in a way that we can deal with and we can use to compartmentalize the various sense experiences that we get from the world. So life is about motion, and therefore life has momentum, because according to Newton's first law, which he talks about, matter which is in motion remains in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. Thereby, the vitality of life will stay in motion until compelled by an outside force. But the problem is we're constantly impelled and compelled by outside forces. Constantly, for example, my body is having to expend energy in order to maintain itself against the onslaught of forces outside of the body that require my body to maintain itself. Therefore, the body is constantly running down, and life is constantly running down, therefore having to expend energy and interact with the environment to maintain itself. Therefore, life is in what Hobbes calls a state of nature, in which rule number one is myself. It is the maintenance of the individual biological organism. And the organism will use whatever means necessary and, through its will, enact those means to achieve the end of peace and security. That is what life is trying to maintain for Hobbes. And therefore, as an organism of any kind, it doesn't necessarily have to be a human, but a human is the only one that has a sense of conscience or intelligence or imagination in this way. It's the only one that has autonomy or will for Hobbes. And through the will, it comes to know various things in sense experience and to experience them as agreeable or disagreeable, as something which it assents to and desires or disdains. Therefore, Hobbes says that everything presents itself to us as an object of desire and love, or hate and aversion. And that because the constitution of a man's body is in continual mutation, it is impossible that all the same things should always cause in him the same appetites and aversions, right? Different things are either beneficial or not at different times. I'm thirsty and water is beneficial. I'm overloaded with water. I've drank so much, it's no longer so nice. Much less, he continues, can all men consent in the desire of almost any one in the same object. We are excited or averted by a variety of different objects, none of us sharing, in general, the same objects of desire. But whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite, Hobbes says, or desire, that is it which he for his part calleth good, and the object of his hate and aversion evil, and of his contempt vile and inconsiderable. For these words of good, evil, and contemptible are ever used with relation to the person that useth them, there being nothing simply and absolutely so, nor any common rule of good and evil to be taken from the nature of the objects themselves. In other words, ethics in the state of nature is relative. It is relative to the entity which sees something as useful or not, as contemptible and against its survival instincts, or to the help of those instincts. Therefore, because, for example, water does not present every organism in every situation as good or as evil, for some organisms who, for example, live in water, they might not use it or need it in the same way that an organism that does not live in the water may. And also, even an organism that does not live in the water may sometimes need its thirst quenched and at other times not. Therefore, the notion of good and evil and what we ought to desire is something malleable, something contingent. This is how humans exist in the state of nature. But we come upon a problem soon, which is that we have a variety of different needs that need to be met for a variety of different organisms. And the power of a man, to take it universally, he says, is his present means to obtain some future apparent good. The power within us is our ability to achieve our desired ends. And the best way to achieve these desired ends is through a community, through what Hobbes calls a commonwealth, in which the greatest of human powers is united by consent in one person, natural or civil, that has the use of all their powers depending on his will, such as is the power of a commonwealth, or depending on the wills of each particular, such as is the power of a faction of or diverse fashions leagued. Therefore, to have servants is power, to have friends is power, for they are strengths united. Right? Power comes in unity. It's a proportional concept. The greater the ability one has to achieve in the present one's future desired goals, the greater is the power. And therefore, we will value different things and value different authorities as more or less powerful. Hobbes indeed understands value as something relative, something to do with the economy of means. He says the value or worth of a man is, as of all other things, his price. That is to say, so much as would be given for the use of his power and therefore is not absolute, but a thing dependent on the need and judgment of another. In other words, power is linked to appraisal. In what ways are your abilities appraised as beneficial to a community? Therefore, we are indeed, as Aristotle calls us, political animals, concerned with the achievement of ends. But this end of a community is not something just sitting out there. As Hobbes says, the felicity of this life consisteth not in the repose of a mind satisfied. In other words, not in something that just sits there. Rather, it's something that moves and does things. For there is no such finis ultimus, or utmost aim, nor a summum bonum, the greatest good, as is spoken of in the books of the old moral philosophers. Nor can a man any more live whose desires are at an end than he whose senses and imaginations are at a stand. Felicity is a continual progress of the desire from one object to another, the attaining of the former being still but the way to the latter. In other words, this is a constant process of extending towards the future, of trying to find something that's worth doing, worth expending my energy on. And Hobbes, being the modernist philosopher he is informed by the philosophy of René Descartes. And Descartes has a spectator theory of knowledge, in which one is a subject viewing a world of objects, perception being the link between the two. One is assailed by a number of primary qualities, which are then transformed into secondary qualities by the sensory apparatuses and are delivered to the mind, to the subject or the cogito, the thinking thing, as a representation. Primary qualities would be things like mass, that are inherent in the object in the world. And the secondary qualities would be things like color. These are things which result from the interaction between the thing and the limitations of our sensory apparatus used to obtain it. Because, of course, the wavelengths of interactions between the object and our sensory apparatuses and the cones in our eyes and everything gives us the perception of color, which is in fact not an intrinsic quality of the object, but rather a secondary quality. And because of this spectator theory of knowledge, we have this notion of the subject as some sort of general thinking thing, which Descartes calls the cogito. And the cogito just thinks and perceives. And of course, it perceives all different manner of objects, but subjects basically have this common perceptive ability. And this informs an egalitarianism central to the epistemology of Thomas Hobbes, which is the equal capacity of people to perceive the world. Therefore, he writes that nature hath made men so equal in the faculties of body and mind, as that though there be found one man sometimes manifestly stronger in body, or of quicker mind than another, yet when all is reckoned together, the difference between man and man is not so considerable as that one man can thereupon claim to himself any benefit to which another may not pretend as well as he. For as to the strength of body, the weakest has strength enough to kill the strongest, either by secret machination or by confederacy with others that are in the same danger with himself. In other words, we use the capacity of our minds to go beyond the strengths of the body, such that all have the capacity to take part in the reasoning process. He says prudence is but experience, which equal time equally bestows on all men in those things they equally apply themselves unto. And this is a promise that is central to the modernist epistemology, that if I try hard and I really try to get rid of my biases, that I can get some truth from perception, that I can be promised that I have some minimum relationship to an actual world. And I think we're stumbling upon an anxiety that isn't really properly understood until, close to the 20th century, or even kind of the postmodern period after World War II, where we really start to investigate an ontological uncertainty that might preclude the possibility of that minimal connection. But Hobbes kind of takes that for granted and says that, in fact, everyone is trying to preserve themselves and their ability to interact with the world and the communities they are in. Hereby, he says, it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war as is of every man against every man. For war consisteth not in battle only, or in the act of fighting, but in a tract of time wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. We are in a state of scarcity, of uncertainty, where the future is not yet a guarantee, but rather a provisional hope, and one is alone in a world in which continual fear and danger of violent death is everywhere, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, as Hobbes puts it. Therefore, we are all self-interested, trying to escape our state of nature. And this self-interest is very different than selfishness for Hobbes. There's no value judgment here. He's just trying to nail down some concept of human nature, of really biological nature, of the way that biological living entities with their vital energy, which Hobbes says that they have from birth and is maintained until they die and cease, and that vitality is no longer with them, they try to maintain that. But this self-interest is just a fact, not a value judgment. He says that the desires and other passions of man are in themselves no sin. No more are the actions that proceed from those passions till they know a law that forbids them, which, till laws be made, they cannot know, nor can any law be made till they have agreed upon the person that shall make it. In other words, before there's laws made, the concept of illegality, of criminality, of sin, of wrong, doesn't make any sense. If it's in my self-interest, that's what good is. Good is working in my self-interest, of making my own moral code. Because, right, value and duty is just maintaining my peace. This is a duty and a moral fact, and one of the few that Hobbes sees present in all biological life. Anything that has vital energy has the duty by natural law, through reason, right? We're determining and locating this duty through reason to maintain itself in a state of peace against that which might assail it. Therefore, Hobbes writes, to this war of every man against every man, this also is consequent, that nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice, have there no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where there is no law, no injustice. Force and fraud are in war the two cardinal virtues. Justice and injustice are none of the faculties, neither of the body nor mind. If they were, they might be in a man that were alone in the world, as well as his senses and passions. In other words, this is something that we could just find inherent in someone alone, which we don't. We only find the sense of morality in communities that need to maintain themselves, need to build up some sense of social cohesion. They are qualities that relate to men in society, not in solitude. It is consequent also to the same condition that there be no propriety, no dominion, no mine and thine distinct, but only that to be every man's that he can get, and for so long as he can keep it. And thus much for the ill condition which man by mere nature is actually placed in, though with the possibility to come out of it, consisting partly in the passions, partly in his reason. And the passions are that which incline man to peace, are those of fear and death. So fear and death for Hobbes is the baseline prior to society, because Hobbes really is doing a sort of shoddy anthropology here. Of course, we know that this is not necessarily how societies work. Men have never been alone in this world, and there has always been some sense of probably family, right? You come from a mother, and this is the first connection you form, and you come into this world crying and screaming, and immediately form that connection to help satisfy your desires. Therefore, this sort of state of solitude in which I am completely alone seems rather a fable of Hobbes, an individualist fable in which I'm an isolated subject assailed by a world of objects which I'm alienated from. Nevertheless, his point stands that we are always motivated by fear, desire, and hope, which we hope will lead us towards peace. And that is where we stumble upon the need for the commonwealth. In the state of nature, man has the right to everything. Anything that he can do, why not do it if it will serve his ends? Therefore, liberty is maximized in the state of nature, but peace and prosperity may be rather short and bleak. Therefore, men will enter into a pact with one another, whereby they may lay down this right to all things, in other words, the right to do whatever I please, and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. This is a sort of negative golden rule in which he says, what you do not want done to you, do not do to another. And we enter into a pact where, for example, I agree not to kill you and you not to kill me. I'll agree not to steal from you and you not steal from me, etc., etc. And you do this to the minimum extent that you can maintain social cohesion. Maximizing liberty maximizes the ability of one to exercise their power and their will in meeting their ends, thus minimizing the constraints of the social, but we also maximize the profitability that would come from entering into a social pact. And if you couldn't tell thus far, fear is going to be a central part of the political regime established by Hobbes. He writes, the fear of the former is in every man his own religion, which hath place in the nature of man before civil society. In other words, fear has always existed, so for Hobbes, religion has always existed, because religion is a way, as he said prior to this, of dealing with one's fears, trying to personify those fears, to come up with a sense of agency and deal with uncertainty. Thereby, so that before the time of civil society, or in the interruption thereof by war, there is nothing can strengthen a covenant of peace agreed on against the temptations of avarice, ambitions, lust, or other strong desire, but the fear of that invisible power, which they every one worship as God, and fear as a revenger of their perfidy. All, therefore, can be done between two men not subject to civil power, is to put one another to swear by the God he feareth. In other words, that common fear is the first step to a society. A common project, which is a common peace to be reached against a common enemy. Therefore, this is the development of in-group versus out-group thinking, the beginning of a sense of who we have a duty to, that being the in-group, and whom we do not, that being the out-group. Thus, we have the beginning of, for example, understanding what does it mean to be a moral agent. Because if you're in the in-group, you're owed certain moral decencies, and if you're not, you might not even be an agent, you might not even be a human or an entity worth protection. Therefore, we can introduce things like just war theory to come up with excuses to kill other people that might otherwise be deemed ethically worthwhile through the machinations of this isolationist ethical theory. Hence the necessity for hierarchy and order for Hobbes. We need representatives who can take the community and compact the community's multiplicity into a unity. A multitude of men are made one person when they are by one man or one person represented so that it be done with the consent of every one of that multiple in particular. For it is the unity of the representer, not the unity of the represented, that maketh the person one. In other words, if we're thinking about a community as an autonomous entity, which needs to act in synchronicity, such that it can achieve its ends as one, as if it were a combined voice, it needs to be combined and made unity, not in the variety of people, but in the voice used to represent them, in that which stands in for them. Therefore, it is the representer that beareth the person of the community. That every man giving their common representer authority from himself in particular, and owning all the actions the representer doth. In other words, in a representative system for Hobbes, we literally, as individuals, take ownership for the actions of the sovereign, because the sovereign is our will. Hobbes has a notion of consent of the governed, whereby when you enter into this social pact, you give license. You give the sense of will and power you had to the sovereign such that they maintain your political community. And the reason Hobbes says that we need this sovereign is because without it, if it's in our interest to violate a social contract or pact made between two people to mutually give up their rights, then they will do it. If, for example, we both agree we won't kill each other, but I'm starving and find that I could kill you and get away with it, then I will do it. Or if, for example, I can give to my community the semblance of obeying these pacts, where in secret I do not, then I've got all the benefits of the pact, of the mutual sense of trust and cohesion, while everyone else pays the price for it. Therefore, we need a sovereign in order to maintain pacts. Covenants without the sword, he says, are but words and of no strength to secure a man at all. Therefore, notwithstanding the laws of nature, which everyone hath then kept when he has the will to keep them, when he can do it safely, in other words, when it's in my interest, if there be no power erected, or not great enough for our security, every man will and may lawfully rely on his own strength and art for caution against all other men. In other words, we all expect that when we get in a tough situation, we will do rash things. We will potentially violate the social niceties, and we will kill and maim and defect and all of these other things. We understand that people do this. This is why we have an understanding for people who do bad things in bad situations. Therefore, the sovereign is necessary that we maintain the covenants, not just when it's in our interest, but in principle, in perpetuity going forward. That way we might have guaranteed the necessary social cohesion. This leads to the great tyranny and hierarchy of the Leviathan, whereby Hobbes says that one confers all their power and strength upon one man or upon one assembly of men, that may reduce all their wills by plurality of voices unto one will, and every one to own and acknowledge himself to be author of whatsoever he that beareth their person shall act or cause to be acted in those things which concern the common peace and safety, and therein to submit to their wills every one to his will, and their judgments to his judgments. In other words, this is complete submission of one's sense of authorship of the actions of the community. It gets siphoned up the hierarchy, such that one submits to authority and agrees that one's actions are, by one's consent, the sovereign's actions, and that the sovereign's actions are one's own actions. Therefore, this, he says, is the generation of that great Leviathan, or rather, to speak more reverently, of that mortal God to which we owe, under the immortal God, our peace and defense. For by this authority, given him by every particular man in the commonwealth, he hath the use of so much power and strength conferred on him that, by terror thereof, he is enabled to conform the wills of them all to peace at home and mutual aid against their enemies abroad. And Hobbes sees this as great. This fear compact means that this is going to work, because Hobbes says, I know humans, so I know how they're going to form communities, and I know how we're going to keep those communities safe. And it might seem like a bit of a downer, but Hobbes literally says in this work that any polity is better than none. Any social cohesion is better than none for him, because the state of nature is pure constant chaos with no social cohesion, and a state of commonwealth in which covenants are maintained by a sovereign, by the Leviathan. We therefore have everything good and artful and worthy of calling respectful. That being said, these are just the basics discussed in Hobbes' Leviathan. I hope this helps kind of elucidate some of his ideas, understand the notion of the social contract, of sovereignty, of the development of moral and ethical codes, and the legitimation of authority, the recognition of sovereignty, and the creation of laws. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and I'd really appreciate anything you have to give, but no pressure whatsoever. Keep out for yourself. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.